last week we began this journey on to kill or not to kill. Does God really care? And we tried to take a look at the biblical story and what's available in that handout. Last week, the outline for the presentation, and then the listing of killing, murder in the Bible from that online source, Evil Bible. We had a chance to explore some of those possibilities. But remember the framework that we worked with, that I just popped out for us to kind of use as sort of a roadmap of understanding what are we talking about when we talk about ethics and morals and values. This is a nicer umbrella. I get a better marker. The big umbrella top I identified as what? Oh, man.
I wasn't here, I would tell you.
I know, I think you would remember too. See, the pop quiz time, friends. The opposed, which the big topic is, that's right, ethics. See, you've been thinking that all the time, right? Ethics. And ethics is the search for the truth, or even more profound, the good. And then, if ethics is the big bridging search for the good, the next kind of step in line coming through this process, and you can go both directions, is what part of thinking about right and wrong, truth, that sort of thing, good, comes out of community, morality. So I talk about morals or morality, and that's very much the right and wrong as influenced, shaped, and molded by community or sub-communities. And then, what is the personal? What word do we use when we're talking about ethics, morality, and the personal journey?
Value.
Values, right. This is very much the what's going on inside me, in my brain, in my understanding, my heart. As we look at values, what is it that is important to me? Now, we also understand that what is important to me has been heavily influenced by morality. You know, what I understand to be right and wrong, good and bad, is powerfully influenced by the community I was raised in, my own family and my family's moral system, and above all, the ethics that search for the good. And as Christians, ethics, Christian ethics, is shaped and molded by the good. And the obvious question is, who or what is the good in Christian ethics? Oh, thank you, Lord. See, I should have had multiple colors, and it would retain more. Our struggle as Christians And not only Christians, but people of the faith and people of the book in particular, whether Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, or Islamic tradition, because those are the three great religions of the world that are the people of the book, as it says in the Quran. People of the book are those who have focused on what we talk about as the Bible. Okay? Our struggle, our journey, our God story is how do our personal values and our community morality jive with the ethics that are found in God. So often we say, okay, we go to the Bible and we ask the question, what is it that God would want us to do? Or we can use other ways of doing that. We can ask the question, what would Jesus do? Right? That's another way of asking basically the same question. What is the ethic that I work with? What is the understanding of good? What is expected of me, my community, whether it be my social community, and in the civic realm, my church community, my faith community, my family, or as I prefer, not asking the question, what would Jesus do, but what would Jesus have me do? That's a segue. Now, I hope you got the handouts back there. And if you need last week's, those are available. Okay. You notice that our first journey this morning has to do with take evil seriously, take sin seriously, take free will seriously. I emphasize again of something I was pointing at last week, that if you're looking for justification in the Bible for what you want to do, or what you think is right, the good, you can find justification and be able to say, see, it says it right there in the Bible, on any topic, any position you want to take in life. Because it's all going to be there. And if you know, that's why there are no real simple answers when it comes to coming to an understanding of what is it that God would have us do. If God is the good, where is it? How is it that we understand the good? Okay? So, when we start to look at the Bible and find that as a framework in which to start thinking, we can struggle with this a little bit, because sometimes it's not absolutely all clear, right? We can say, well, the commandment says you should not kill, but then the good translations are you should not murder. So does that mean you can kill but not murder? Or does it intertwine somehow? And what does it mean to say you should not kill? How far do we take that? When we come to those questions of, taking evil seriously, taking sin seriously, and taking free will seriously, those are tied together in my mind. Let me share with you a little bit of what I'm getting after. Let's take a look at what kind of, if we do this reverse kind of thing, let's start with free will. And usually, since we're talking about free will, we're talking about the individual. Me, myself, and I. Free will. I can do whatever I want to do. That's kind of a way of understanding that, isn't it? And if you want to see the best example of some person trying to exercise free will, spend time with the 2-year-old. His Majesty the King, or Her Majesty the Queen. I can do whatever I want. No, you can't. Yes, I can. Don't eat the cake. Okay? I can do what I want. And how often the word no comes into the vocabulary. The definition of a 2-year-old. No. Right? I think for most of us, we work with this idea that somehow I have a free will to choose God or not to choose God. To do right or not to do right. But I think we need to be real careful about that. It's not, in my mind, and if you want to challenge me, please do. I do not see it as a religious, as a Christian now, I'm speaking, as a religious or social absolute. If we got into the world of psychology and genetics, how much of who I am and what I do is shaped by all that DNA floating around inside me and the whole genetic stuff, right? A propensity to move one way or the other. There is a marvelous article I ran across in Atlantic magazine a number of years ago, and I cannot remember the author, but it was about that morality, ethics, are genetically instilled in us, and that's what, not by a sense of passing it, passing the cards up, but just the sense of our genetic structure. That as a human being, there is this sense of right and wrong. And if I understand correctly, Doctor, that's kind of the idea of a psychopath or a sociopath, isn't it? That somehow it's not working up there. And we become, what, kind of an antisocial or asocial, meaning no social value at all? Is that kind of what am I close?
You're close, Paul. Very close. Yeah.
Could you add a thought or something on that?
Well, the antisocial personality contrast to the rest of us usually has no feeling of remorse or guilt for doing what he or she wishes, even though it's against the morality of our culture.
Yeah. There are some folks out
lifelong thing it's often unchangeable.
Yeah. And so what we usually have to do is lock them up someplace to protect ourselves from those folks, right? I mean, that's kind of real simplistic. I have a friend of mine out in Virginia who, as an attorney, has worked for the Attorney General of Virginia and then with the Department of Corrections. And he has spent a big chunk of his career before retiring with the Department of Corrections building prisons, being kind of the guy who goes over everything and makes it pay, and hires out to private companies to build prisons for this Commonwealth of Virginia. And he has a lot of stories about what prisons are about, not as an inmate, but as somebody who works in the midst of that world. And the sociopath, the psychopath, I mean, just all of those sort of realities. I think there is a point at which we say that free will is somehow there. The Bible tells us that if we go and take a look at that idea of free will, the beginning point is the encounter of, in the story of the garden and the fall, of Eve encountering the serpent. And the serpent tempting Eve. Okay? Why did God tell you you can't eat from that tree? The tree of life, of knowledge, right? That life tree over there. And, oh, well, because he told them, we're not supposed. But you know why he really told you? Is because once you eat of that tree, the fruit of that tree, then you shall be like who? God. The temptation was not to eat the fruit. The temptation was be like God. And she gets sucked in, which opens the door to the presence of evil in the world. There are consequences to behavior, and we've said that all along. Some people will say, how come God allows all this stuff to happen? If we went around the room, there would be many different answers. Why does God allow suffering and bad things to happen? The reality is, in my mind, what the Bible is telling us is God honors us in our humanness. We are not robots. We're not puppets on the end of the string. We're not Kermit, with God kind of playing with us. But we are responsible for our actions. And when we look for what is the source of suffering and evil, Genesis 3 begins to tell us. It's right here. Look in the mirror. I need to quickly say, because I've used that line so often, and I believe it, and I hang on to it, because I think that's what the Bible is telling us, that also when I look at good that I do, the good that I do, I can look in the mirror and say, I do it, but it's thankfully, it's because of God's kind of not giving up on me, right? We're often willing to look in the mirror and say, oh, I did such a good job today. You know, I'm glad I did that. I helped that little mom out by kind of hanging on to her little kiddo and entertaining him while she had to do something else. I was such a good boy. Look where the stick and the thumb and the plum, and what a good little boy am I, right? Well, but part of our nature, as demonstrated in the fall, is when something goes wrong, who do we have a tendency to give the credit to when things go wrong? Yeah. Blame God, yeah. God, why are you doing this to me? How free are we? We struggle with this. We struggle with this. The reality is that we are responsible for the consequences of our actions. Whether we are really free to choose right and wrong in those actions is maybe another issue. So let's move and take a look at that word, what is sin? Now, in Romans, Paul talks about that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. What do you think the word sin means for you? How do you understand that word? Yes?
Destruction of relationships.
Wow, yeah, destruction of relationships. Starting with who? God, yeah, right there. And then it kind of permeates out. Paul is, in those powerful words, that which I, excuse me, that which I would do, I do not. That which I would not do, I do. The struggle, how easy it is to act out in a negative way, to destroy those relationships. The pain, the hurt in families and communities in the world. Sin is not individual actions. Like there was that time when if you danced or played cards or tipped one occasion, that that was a sin. No. It could be stupid at times to do that sort of thing, depending on where. But I remember when I was in high school, this hemline started to come up. And the Dean of Girls, some of you remember this, maybe, okay? And she would have the girls kneel on the floor, and if the hemline did not touch the floor, they had to go home and change their skirt. Yeah, okay. I kind of liked it myself, again. But the hemline is not the sin. It's what comes from inside. It's the attitude. It's what is motivating us, you know. And it usually revolves around those relationships, and that is starting with God. Sir.
Got nothing to do with hemlines, but try to understand what you said about the original sin.
Okay.
The temptation was not the apple, but to be like God.
Yes, sir.
What's wrong with that? Why would that be a sin? That's what we're striving to be, isn't it?
Yes or no?
Yes or no?
Yes. I would say yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
It seems to me that if we're talking about becoming more godlike, that's what the journey of sanctification is about. You're right there. Becoming holy, to become more like God. But we do that. See, there's a but qualification, right? As the creatures of God. We are not the creator, we are the created. And we are not the subject. God is the subject. We are the object. The temptation in the garden was to become God, which means that we move from our creature status to playing, living in, claiming the authority and the role of the Creator.
Take over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Does that help?
It does. Yes.
Okay. Whoa. Somebody said, that's very good. My professors are just sitting there or lying in their graves right now with a smile on their faces saying, he did pay attention.
But the credit goes to God.
But the credit goes to God. Amen. And then this thing called evil. Mark says, Jesus tells us that evil is not what comes from the outside, but what comes from the inside, what comes out of us. And in that process, he is driving home, Jesus is driving home, that this thing that we call evil is not conjured up by God, but conjured up by us in our attempt to be God. Losing our sense of proportion, our sense of place, and our sense of wonderful opportunity. As, God created us a little less than the angels in one translation of Psalm 8, than God himself in another translation of Psalm 8. We are in a great place, the apple of his eye, the wonder of his handiwork. But we also have the capacity to go against that which God has created. Evil is, for all practical purposes, the effort to destroy that which God has given. And we ask, what is it that God has given? That's what we wrestle with here to understand, and what we come to understand as the creatures of God. So, when something is so vile that we shake our heads and just say, no, no, this is beyond the pale. We begin to realize that capacity in us to be destructive, in some ways to the absolute nth degree, can drive and move us, and it becomes an evil. Evil, in the simplest, I guess I would say, is that sense of evil is that which is out, or that power that exists to destroy what God has given. Yeah.
I've always thought of it, or heard of it, as the devil, Satan, the good
Yes.
spirit and the bad spirit, and there's this conflict.
Excellent. That's an excellent observation. In the biblical material, how do we try to personify evil rather than just this abstract out there? And in the biblical material, that personification of evil goes to one who is identified as Satan or the devil. The power of darkness. That which is the power that wants to destroy what God has given. If we want to make the devil a reality in a sense, I mean, evil is real. The power of evil is real in our world. If we want to personify the devil as a concept and put the name on there, that's fine. If you want to kind of personalize it and think of a literal creature, that's fine too. Either way, it gets back to the power of evil. There is the atonement. You've heard of atonement theories. So in other words, what was Jesus doing, right? When he dies on the cross, was he, you know, how, and one of them is what's called the victorious Christ, Christus Victor. And the concept of Christus Victor is that what happens on the cross is not a personal thing for you and me, right? It is the cosmic war that occurs between God in Christ and the power of evil. The power of God and the power of evil. And it's fought beyond us. It's fought in the kind of what's called the cosmic Christ. And there are other atonement theories, but to be made at one with God, that's one of the understandings. And that's part of that sense of the evil. I wouldn't get into killing. Are we ready to shift?
Good stuff.
Okay.
This is good stuff.
I wrote down there, do we wield the sword of violence or extend the hand of compassion? What is it that God wants us to do? Wield that sword of violence, of death and destruction, or to extend the hand of compassion, of mercy, of life? We're caught in the struggle with that as human beings, especially as Christians who keep hearing all this good stuff about a loving God and Jesus and, you know, the Christ and all that redemption and all that good stuff. But that's a thought. Just hang on to that in the back of your head. And then let me also ask you, last week, we didn't get there because I got all distracted. And last week we talked about the peaceable kingdom. Jerry Anderson, whose wife Barb died last summer, and whose paintings are for about another week, I understand. They're going to be upstairs. This is one of her pieces. And if you can't see it well, I'll leave it here and you can look at it afterwards. It's Can anybody see it close enough to tell me what it is? A lion laying down with the lamb? A little child? What are we talking about?
Peaceable.
Peace, the peaceable kingdom. Out of Isaiah. A lamb shall, lie down with the lion. The child shall play with the asp, one of the most deadly, poisonous snakes in the world. And there shall be shalom. Peace. It comes out of Isaiah, and it was one of those that I referenced as a thread that runs through. Sometimes it doesn't get seen very easily or quickly in the scriptures, but it runs through the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation for us as Christians. And I think Barb did a fantastic, Barb film. It was before she married Jerry. And then she still did her artwork under the film name, her family name. It would seem to me that the peaceable kingdom has a powerful message from God for us. How do we get to the kingdom? How do we get to the peaceable kingdom? Anybody want to venture a thought on that? Please do.
I'm not sure we do in this life.
Okay, say more.
Well,
Okay, but it's,
Want me to?
yeah, you get to be the guy that passes that around so everybody can hear it. I don't have to repeat it.
well, I don't have an answer, I just have a statement.
Okay.
I'm not sure we do in this life, but it's the next life that's the peaceful thing. Certainly the world doesn't seem to be getting any better in terms of people getting along, building relationships.
The human condition doesn't change?
Right.
Okay. And often one of the ways we say this is he or she is in a better place, right? When somebody dies, they're in a better place now. That they have completed their earthly journey and have now moved into a different part of the world.
Now, after the second coming, which I don't pretend to be very knowledgeable about,
Okay,
perhaps it changes that, I don't know.
perhaps. Yeah. It does seem fascinating. My sense is that you're wrong. I don't think it's all completed in this earthly journey. But I also am convinced that this peaceful kingdom is for this world too. This life also. And I think God is giving us a kind of a goal to move towards. Thank you for sharing that. Now, in the history of the church, there have been some efforts at trying to figure out how do we get to the peaceful kingdom in this world, knowing that ultimately the promise in death is to be in the presence of God and in the wonder of the New Jerusalem and all that good stuff. Right? But how do we get there? The church has been struggling with this for about 2,000 years. The peace church movement and pacifism is one way. You notice I listed a number of religious communities that we're acquainted with. The Mennonites, the Amish, the Christian Brethren, which came from Germany with them, the Quakers, or Religious Society of Friends, the Hutterites, the Seventh-day Adventists. By the way, that's where they started. They are no longer a peace church, but there was a sizable proportion of the Seventh-day Adventists when they started that was a peace church. And over the decades, years, that's kind of shifted, where the Seventh-day Adventists are still kind of like the idea of peace, like us. You know, after all, Lutherans like this too, you know. But they are not identified historically now as a continuing peace church. Okay, the Jehovah's Witnesses are another one. I personally have trouble identifying them as Christian. They would not necessarily identify themselves as Christians, but they are definitely part of that peace church heritage. What is it that distinguishes the peace church? That label that we put on it, like peace church movement and pacifism. The Mennonites, the Amish, the Quakers, the Hutterites, what is it about them that they do as a community that is in their moral fabric and in their moral DNA that sets them apart?
No violence.
No violence. Exactly.
And sharing.
And sharing. Very much so. And as it blows the minds of people when the Amish are, and these other communities are targeted for violence, which is horrible stuff. They don't strike back. They forgive. And one Amish leader, remember the girls that were shot in school in Pennsylvania? And it was, what blew my mind was that there were millions and millions of Americans that said, how can they do that? What is this forgiveness thing? And they asked one of the leaders of the community, why do you forgive such an evil act? And he said, because we are told that's what we must do. Who told you that? Who told us that? God. Particularly in who? Jesus. The thing about the Peace Church movement is that they have taken God at His word. You should not kill. You should not act out in violence. When somebody asks for your coat, give them your cloak too. When they ask you to go with them for a mile, go 2 miles. When they strike you on one cheek, turn the other. Pray for your enemies and those that persecute you, those that wish you dead. Pray for them. Forgive them.
In addition to that, I think they also are churches, at least some of the ones I'm most familiar with, that also are very much dedicated to service and acts of mercy toward others. So it isn't just not being violent, but it's also deliberately and intentionally reaching out in love and mercy to others.
Exactly. One of the things, the practices, way of life that the Peace Church communities do is in one shape or form or another withdrawal from society. They still might be in it. But to be actively engaged in the social order is not common. Part of it is because in the Peace Church understanding is that the world is going to the devil. And that the world is a fallen world. And to be part of that allows you then to become accomplice to evil. They will respect government and the social order, but if you go to the Amish community, or if you go up to North Dakota and Alberta and Saskatchewan, to the Hutterite communities, if you go to many Quaker communities, you're not going to see them engaged in what we talk about as citizenship in this world. Because this is a fallen world. And if there's any sense of growing in our sanctification, in our holiness, it is to detach ourselves from this world. If you want to read the definitive work that went into this, letter H, Richard Niebuhr, Niebuhr, B-U-H-R, yeah. His brother, Reinhold, is on my list there. Talk about two brothers. Wow. Brilliant. Out of the 20th century. Christ and Culture was the definitive work that H. Richard Niebuhr, the historian brother, wrote. And he talks about 5 models, and one of those is Christ outside the world, or Christ against the world. I'll refer you there, and it's a brilliant journey. And in reality, is that just about everything that is talked about, how do we relate to society, how do we as Christians engage with the world, goes back to that definitive work. And you have to come to grips with what H. Richard talked about, because he presents 5 basic models. Christ in culture is another model, one that we are probably more familiar with. That as Christians, we are, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, we cannot detach ourselves. We must be vitally involved. We must suffer and be engaged in trying to bring sanity to the world. So it's a very different than separation. But also, I think one of the things to remember about our friends who make up the Peace Church movement is that their pacifism came out as very strongly was influenced by the fact that they were not the ruling party. They were minority movements. And usually in most of the places they began the state church. Unlike in the United States. Remember we talked about this a couple of years ago, that religion and government went hand in glove. If you were a Frenchman, you were Catholic. If you were Catholic, you were a Frenchman. So what happened to the Huguenots? They got persecuted and almost slaughtered. Well, some of them got slaughtered, but as a community, they almost got obliterated. In Holland, where the Mennonites had their roots, Menno Simons was the man who said, no, you got to be baptized when you can decide, make a decision baptism. And the church is separate and apart from the world, and that we are not to practice violence, which, just went in the face of in Holland, of the state church that was hand in glove as government and church. These were minority movements. The Quakers in America, when you think of usually William Penn, Pennsylvania. Okay. For about 150 years or something like that, the Quakers ran the colony of Pennsylvania. But they ran into a problem. The problem they ran into was that as the government of Pennsylvania, out on the western frontier, as more and more white settlers kept moving out to places like Johnstown and towards Ohio, the Native American population said, wait a minute, this is our land. What are you doing here? Go away, go away. And not everybody that went out there was Quaker. And so there were the Indian uprisings. And the Quaker government in Philadelphia said, whoa, we've got a problem on our hands. The Indians don't like what's going on out there, but it's not good for them to go kill those settlers. So we need to provide some sort of protection for them. And the end result was the Quaker government of Pennsylvania said, we're not going to run the state as a commonwealth any longer. It's your non-Quakers' turn to take over, because we can't raise an army. You can.
Respectfully, Paul, I'm getting nervous because you have 15 minutes to tell me whether God cares or not.
Thank you, sir.
Right now, I'm not sure.
Okay. Good point. See, this happened last week too. Okay, now let's take a quickie look here. I talked about Francis of Assisi, Leo Tolstoy, Albert Schweitzer, Martin Luther King Jr. These are all people that have their own stories, but are examples of the peace church movement in some way, shape, or form. The nonviolent resistance, do not return evil for evil. The traditional church and the qualified sanctions of violence come about way back into the early church in Rome. And Constantine in about 300 became emperor of Rome, and as emperor of Rome, he took on Christianity and decreed that Christianity was the official religion of Rome. And so all of a sudden, what was going on for the first 200 and nearly 300 years, which was that Christians were a minority group and were in opposition, all of a sudden they became part of the ruling class. And when you become part of the ruling class, your things are shifting here in the morality thing. And then the question is, okay, how do we help govern? I mean, after all, we're the official religion of Rome. And the early church had a strong pacifist movement in it. Mainly because to become a member of the Roman Legion or to become an official in Roman government, you had to pay homage to Caesar as the Son of God. A little bit of conflict up to that. Okay. So the Christians were not real supportive of that. If we look at some of the other little pieces here, we'll see what they tried to do, and that is that handout on the just war doctrine. When to go to war and right conduct in battle. Christians had a conscience, and they said, well, you just can't go willy-nilly off to war and killing people and making havoc and destroying peoples and nations and all this just because you want to go have some fun, or because the emperor thinks it's a good idea this week that we go do that. So the whole question became, I think it's the blue sheet, became, okay, if as Christians we have to go to war, how do we do it? What are the grounds? What are the justifications for doing this? And then when we're fighting in a war, what is right and proper conduct for Christians? The Peace Church looked at the understanding of what? That you should not. They turned to Jesus and said that's their authority. Thou shalt not kill, you should pray for your enemies, you should help any human being, mercy, kindness, sharing, all that good stuff. And they credit it to God as we encounter God in Christ. Well, you know, Jesus also demonstrated some other things. He never condemned the soldier. One time when he was asked by some soldiers, you know, what must we do, Master? He said, basically, take your wages, don't rip people off, do your job, do it responsibly, but don't abuse your power. That's a lot of my words, but it's there. Okay, that's basically what he was saying to them. He did not condemn the power of the sword as an instrument of government. Paul picks that up in Romans 13. Submit yourselves unto the authority of the magistrates, right? Okay. And when you have to, exercise your responsibility. Now, I asked the question last week on the handout, if you were to have come along on the scene where the Good Samaritan was getting, or that stranger on the road, if you were the Good Samaritan, you were coming along the road, and the robbers were there beating this guy and stealing from him, not after the fact, but during the fact, what would you have done? What would be the Christian thing to do? Pick up a stick and hit them over the head. Yeah, that's a possible response.
If you're in Florida, you shoot.
Okay. If you're in Florida, you shoot them. Luther said that we should never harm another person for our own safety, welfare, and reading. Martin Luther King. But that we have a responsibility to protect and defend the safety and welfare of our neighbor. And we know who our neighbor is, right? Any human being. Okay? Luther comes to that conclusion by looking at those responsibilities that come with being a person living in this world. And that he saw, there's the two kingdoms concept, and the two kingdoms concept is not unique to Martin Luther, but back around 400, Augustine, depending on who you heard it from first, Bishop of Hippo, presented the responsibility of the church, which was an official part of Roman government culture, that we live in two kingdoms, that there are two kingdoms, the kingdom on the right and the kingdom on the left. The kingdom on the right is the church, proclaiming the mercy and love and forgiveness and the gospel of Christ. The kingdom on the left is the power of the sword, instituted by God to provide order in the world. Remember we said take sin seriously, take evil seriously? How do we respond to evil? Our Peace Church friends say you respond not in kind, but rather in love. Seeking justice in love. So, they say, the argument is that we should not pay taxes, but then some say, yeah, you should because you're part, submit unto the authority of the magistrates. Okay, where do we go with this? And I identified, the city of God and the two kingdoms with Augustine, Martin Luther, selective conscientious objection, and the power of the prince. Selective conscientious objection. That means that when the prince comes to you and says, we're going to go to war and attack those guys over there, a war of aggression, he said you have a responsibility to refuse to serve, even if it means you get killed. But if those guys over there attack you, then you have a responsibility to serve the prince in order to help protect your neighbor. That's why it's called selective conscientious objection. The Reinhold Niebuhr, the brother of H. Richard Niebuhr, basically said that pacifism was social irresponsibility. He had no place for it. He said it's a fantasy. Because we live in this world and we need to respond to this world. Okay, Bonhoeffer speaks for himself, basically moved from a pacifist position to being engaged in the attempt to destroy Hitler and paid with it with his life. Okay, my argument would be each person has to make their journey themselves and make their choices themselves. And I hope it's not an easy choice. But somewhere along the line, when we think about the world in which we live, ever hear the phrase, where's a cop when you need him? Would you want to live even in a wonderful community like Rochester, without any law enforcement agencies, without a police, without a sheriff? It would be nice if we could, wouldn't it? You know, I'm basically, I'll admit, I'm a pacifist at heart. But I am driven by the care for the neighbor that says, I can't stay there. So I have a responsibility to move out beyond that. So, yeah. Okay, 1 minute and I'm going to be done. My 1 minute is, Simul Justus et peccata, that's Martin Luther's famous saying, simultaneously, saint, justified, Justus, and peccator, sinner. We are all both saint and sinner at the same time. And we have a responsibility to our brothers and our sisters, because when God asked Cain, where is your brother? And Cain's response was, what, am I my brother's keeper? God never answered that directly, but I think God has answered. My sense is that we need both the Peace Church and the traditional church. We need them both. We need that variety of Christians struggling with the issues of how do I live and act out in my world, and what are my responsibilities. Okay, thank you.